At the same time, and this is why her agenda must be very busy, she is also a senior associate to the World Agroforestry Center, supporting the United Nations work on both agroecology and true cost accounting in agriculture. She has also held multiple positions as an associate faculty at Prescott College in Arizona, a coordinator of the International Pollinator Initiative and delivery manager for ecosystem services and biodiversity at the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, and as a project team member of the Committee on World Food Security of the UN, which is a high-level panel of experts, HLPE, as commonly referred to, and co-wrote the report on agroecological and other innovative approaches for sustainable agriculture and food systems that enhance food security and nutrition. This is a well-known and internationally recognized and highly cited report on agroecology. Prior to joining the UN, she spent 25 years living and working in 3 countries in Africa. So we're pleased to welcome Barbara, and Barbara, please, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm just really pleased to hear that agroecology is gaining some traction within the UC system. My experience has been outside of the US, but I'm happy to contribute to insights from those experiences to share here. And some of the things that Crystal has talked about are things that I have done in the past. I'm not really doing all of those things right now. So Sonia will help me to go through the slides. So if we could go to the next slide, Sonia. Yeah, so I think inevitably when we start to talk about agroecology, we need to deal with why. What's the challenge? Why are we talking about this? And really every statement on the future of agriculture acknowledges that a transformation is needed in the way the sector is conducted. Even in the words of the United Nations, the present paradigm of intensive crop production cannot meet the challenges of the new millennium. This graphic is from the Planetary Boundaries work. This is a project that has been updated over the last decade, seeking to define a safe operating space for humanity by delineating 9 global processes that are critical for maintaining the stability and resilience of the Earth. And in the latest report, nearly all the dashboard lights are throbbing red. The 9 processes, we've already crossed into the danger zone for 6 of these, and at least 5 of them are primarily linked to our agricultural systems: climate change, biodiversity loss, land use change, freshwater use, nutrient flows into the environment. Next slide. As we're speaking about challenges, the latest report from the state of food security and nutrition in the world has shown us that global food insecurity remains much higher than it was during pre-COVID-19 levels, with 2.33 billion people are struggling to access adequate food regularly, and that includes 865 million people who face severe food insecurity. Next slide. Over the last 50 or more years, the global diet we've seen has shifted dramatically so that it includes much greater amounts of major oil crops such as soybean oil and palm oil, and much lesser quantities of regionally important staples like millets, sorghum, cassava. Okay, moving on. So the boundary that we've overshot, the furthest one, is arguably the one that gets sometimes the least attention, of being a dead zone. It's a common term for what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico with nutrient flows, the spillage of nitrogen and phosphorus from our agricultural and industrial processes into our ecosystems. And for billions of years, the rates at which those 2 elements cycled through the world's food chains were relatively stable. But with industrial scale phosphorus mining and the ability to create fertilizer from atmospheric nitrogen for fertilizer manufacturing, nitrogen and phosphorus are now flowing into the environment at up to 3 times the rate at which they can be absorbed. Farmers apply far more synthetic fertilizer and manure to their fields than is necessary as a kind of insurance policy to boost crop yields. And much of it washes into waterways instead of being taken up into the stalks of corn or soybeans. The runoff fuels toxic algal blooms, downstream, which is occurring in the Gulf of Mexico, but also in many places around the world. Moving on. So given all of these challenges, the search has been on for some time to find a new paradigm for agricultural development, but radically different paradigms for the future of agriculture are proposed as solutions. And in the dialogue on sustainable agriculture, the two primary, possibly competing, possibly complementary paradigms currently under discussion are sustainable intensification and agroecology. Moving on. So a key question underlying these divergent paradigms is what can really feed the world? And one side argues that facing world population increase, the most imperative is to increase food production. And this is well known, it's often repeated, and often, as many suggest, a false argument. But because these views are so central to the development of agroecology and is something that really has to be taken on when one works to advance agroecology, I would like to take you through several pieces of evidence that point in a different direction. So the need for such increases in agricultural production that are demanded through the sustainable intensification paradigm, this need is challenged, and some recent estimates indicate that enough food is produced today to potentially feed 9 billion or even almost close to 10 billion people. That's from the Berners-Lee publication. And everything that I cite here, I have in a reference list, so that will be available to those who want it. But this is just a graphic showing that from a total of almost 10,000 kilocalories per person per day is being produced, both in edible crops and in grass and pasture biomass, and that is more than 4 times the average dietary energy requirement for a healthy life. Now, this data is a little bit old, so these numbers certainly will have changed, but not momentously. And this simply shows the loss through that our system has all along before food on that level becomes available. There's many more losses due to inequitable distribution of resources. But the point is that the debate on whether or not agroecology can feed the world is based really on a false premise, since despite these very high levels of production, food insecurity and malnutrition still persist today, even in food exporting countries, such as Brazil and South Africa. Next slide. So an analysis undertaken by the International Resource Panel of the United Nations indicates 3 predominant food systems between traditional food systems, intermediate mixed food systems, and modern food systems. And the first and the second are considered diverse production systems, and the modern system is dominated by only a few crops. So Herrero, who's a very good sort of data digester, he took all this into analysis, including FAO statistical data, and showed that the category of small and medium-sized farms of traditional and mixed systems provide food to an estimated 2/3 of the world's population. The numbers in the typology are obviously, that's also a little bit dated, and there will be more, each of those would be larger numbers since the population has increased, but not to really change the nature of this analysis. And Herrero also, at the same time, he looked at how the diversity of food production changes with the diversity of agricultural landscapes, and documented that the majority of vegetables, I'll just mention a few, but the majority of many food products are produced in diverse landscapes, taken as the number of different products grown within a geographic area, so not within these modern food systems. And that was vegetables, 81%, pulses, 67%, cereals, 56%, just to really emphasize the degree to which, at this point in time, biodiverse landscapes are really an important contributor to feeding the world. We can go on to the next slide. So Pablo Titonel, who, by the way, I think is one of the broadest, most synthetic thinkers on agroecology, and for real nerds, I recommend his recent book, A Systems Approach to Agroecology, which was published in 2023. Pablo always has a surprising way of putting data together. And here we have global cereal production on the y-axis and country level yields on the x-axis. So he shows that 50% of the global production takes place in countries where average cereal yields are lower than 3.1 tons per hectare. And that's at the upper left-hand corner, and at the lower right-hand corner, at the other side of the distribution, the contribution of all the countries where yields are very high, more than 5.9 tons per hectare on average, represents only 12.5% of global cereal production. So we really cannot say that high-yielding industrial agriculture is responsible for feeding the world. The next slide. So if we're asking what can we do to address hunger and malnutrition, this IFPRI study of Smith and Haddad, I think, is key, which looked at what factors contributed most to reducing hunger in 116 countries over 42 years. So extremely comprehensive. And the key determinant was not agricultural production. It was access to safe water. The next most important determinant was female education. Production was important, but not the most important. And the conclusion from this and other studies is that sustainable intensification focusing solely on production is likely to fail in improving food security if it continues to focus narrowly on food production alone, ahead of or equally more important variables that actually influence food security. The next slide. And then if we're asking what can we do to address, no, sorry. So if we're at, I have to go to my next slide myself. Okay, so but if we're looking more broadly at what additional benefits may be of diverse agroecological approaches, I like this analysis from a good colleague, Lucas Garibaldi, who dove into FAO statistics to show that across the globe, countries with higher crop diversity support more agricultural employment, have more employment niches, diversity of employment niches, and do not sacrifice socioeconomic development or economic growth in the process. Okay, next slide. So now I want to go into how paradigms are articulated and how is change promoted in global agriculture. So as an intergovernmental organization, FAO has 194 member nations with delegations representing the agriculture sector in each country. It's headquartered in Rome, Italy, and it has country offices in over 130 countries. To the next slide. So unlike agreements on biodiversity or climate change, which we hear quite a bit about, there are no negotiated agreements between governments on commonly agreed targets in the agriculture sector. And this in spite of the fact that agriculture is considered to account for up to 70% of biodiversity loss, and the numbers for greenhouse gas emissions are by different sources vary, but somewhere around 30 to 40% at least. So going next to how FAO operates. As an intergovernmental organization, it has operational functions as well as normative functions. And the operational functions include dealing with food emergencies, such as on the next slide, you can click through this, insurgencies, drought, conflicts in countries. These emergencies obviously take a lot of priority in funding and in effort within FAO, but they're not the only thing. So if we go to the next slide, at the same time, the normative functions of FAO is equally, if not more important. If you click again, yeah, again, yeah. Normative means developing and articulating ideals, standards, or models based on what is considered to be the best way of doing something. Go to the next slide. Now, turning to how the paradigm of agroecology has been articulated, it's really, I think, very important at the outset to recognize that agroecology has a long history. It is often defined as consisting of three dimensions: science, practice, and movement, by Alexander Wessel. But this is not completely accurate in Pablo Titonel's view, and I concur with this, that practical knowledge is actually very much a part of the science of agroecology. It's not a different dimension of it. There really is no science of agroecology possible if it does not include the wisdom of practitioners and the agents of change that we collectively call the movement. So perhaps we should say more accurately that agroecology is the science of practice and movements. This graphic also conveys that the focus of agroecology has evolved from the plot or field to the agroecosystem, and now increasingly to the overall food system. So with a long and distinguished history, agroecology could hardly be ignored at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, although it was up until about 2013. It was a term that we as program officers were not allowed to use in publications or in public discussions. Although among several of us, we felt that agroecology and working together with our member countries on it was the route to achieving what each of us were trying to do in fairly siloed programs or projects. I was running the International Pollinator Initiative with on-the-ground pollination projects in 11 countries. But it was clear to me that no farmer was going to manage pollination alone. If they were going to stop using pesticides, for example, to protect bees, it had to be in the context of how they manage all interlinked parts of their farm as a whole. And the same realization came to other colleagues working on natural pest management, soil fertility management, along with social and economic aspects of farming. I think together we realized that this needed an overall approach, an overarching linking vision that agroecology could provide. If we go to the next slide, click once at least, if not twice. So just at this time when we were advocating to bring agroecology into the focus of the United Nations, we had a Brazilian director general who understood agroecology very well. He was and has returned to running the Fome Zero, Zero Hunger initiative in Brazil, linking small-scale agroecological farmers with the urban food insecure populations. And he was also a very political animal who, like many politicians in many countries, had no trouble supporting two kinds of agriculture: small-scale agroecological approaches and industrial forms of agriculture. Brazil actually has two ministries of agriculture, one for each of these types. In any case, he opened the door for us to focus on agroecology, or as he said, we are opening a window to agroecology in this cathedral to the Green Revolution. There was a fair amount of pushback from certain countries, US, Argentina, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in particular. But on the other hand, there was strong support from countries that either were developing programs and policies on agroecology or wanted to do so. If you click twice, Sonia, on the international level, FAO convened two symposia on agroecology in 2014 and 2018. And as can be seen, the number of participants, both from civil society and from member countries, increased considerably over that time. We go to the next slide. So up until this time, 2014, agroecology was not in the program of work of agroecology and was not recognized, I would say rather emphatically ignored. Many member countries wanted FAO to work on agroecology and to help them with the transformation. These symposia were to help the international community examine the scope of agroecology. The outputs were proceedings, but they were not negotiated text and involved no official decisions by members, even if we did have high-level representation from countries. The countries asked through these symposium, both the international symposium and the 7 regional symposia, for a better understanding of agroecology. Often they were asking for a definition. And then also, if we are to say that the performance of agroecology should be assessed on multiple criteria, not yield and productivity alone, how can this be done? So the two main responses to these requests have been the 10 elements of agroecology and the development of TAPE, the tool for agroecology performance evaluation. I'll go into a bit more on each of these. With the next slide. So as staff at FAO responsible for carrying out the recommendations from the symposium, we recognized very well that we could not own agroecology. In fact, we came very late to the party, and it would not be our role to impose a singular definition on agroecology, recognizing both that it is a manifestation in it is manifested in very highly context-specific ways, and that no one wants to impose some sort of certification on agroecology's ecological systems to say this is in, this is out. Rather, agroecology should be seen as a domain of transformation, with different people and organizations working at different levels, but always aspiring to improve on multiple dimensions. So the staff at FAO and with outside expertise developed the concept of 10 elements of agroecology, stressing that this is much more than a set of practices. 5 of these focus on more or less on biological, ecological aspects, such as diversity, synergies, efficiency, recycling, and resilience, and 5 on social and economic aspects, with co-creation of knowledge, human and social values, culture and food traditions, responsible governance, and circular and solidarity economy. But the essential point is that one cannot cherry pick and focus on only 1 or 2. The most popular among conventional agriculture is always efficiency. But these must be taken together and used holistically. and not in parts. So to the next slide. To explain a bit the political process at the Food and Agriculture Organization, the conference of the organization, it consists of all 194 country members. And then the council acts as the executive arm of the conference between sessions, exercising functions related to the status of world food and agriculture, prospective activities of the organization, administrative and constitutional matters. And it plays a major role in deciding and advising on the implementation of program and budget execution. The 10 elements became a Food and Agriculture Organization conference resolution in July 2019 and was then endorsed by Council in December of that same year, thus making agroecology a part of the program of work of FAO, meaning that it can both advise governments and work with partners on the ground to implement agroecological projects and initiatives. So to the next slide. We should recognize that there are other frameworks that have similar aspirations as the 10 elements of agroecology. Certainly, Steve Gleesman's was one of the first and best known, with his 5 levels. And the 13 principles of agroecology were developed through the high-level panel of experts report on agroecology, and they also build on a similar perspective. I was part of that high-level panel report, and I will speak a bit more about it in a moment. But just to note here that these are all elaborations of a cohesive outlook, most importantly, moving from agriculture's general focus on a plot or field, Gleesman's level 1 and 2, to the agroecosystem as a whole, and then to a food system approach. With the next slide. The food system approach, as outlined by Titonel, with all of its tremendous complexity, is perhaps a sobering reminder of all that's implied in a food system approach. Next slide. So the 10 elements and the related frameworks are intended as perhaps somewhat theoretical policy guidance documents for member countries. We've used this concept of visual narratives linking the different elements, providing illustrative examples to identify, co-design, and combine the most effective policies to unlock transformations. These are detailed in 2 publications, the Barrios et al. Ecosystems and People, and FAO's 2023 publication, Harnessing the Potential of the 10 Elements of Agroecology. From visual narratives to integrated policy design. The narratives are intended to reveal interdependencies, synergies, and trade-offs in the design of policy. And in this work, we identified 3 promising entry points for policy packages, building on responsible governance: biodiversity, consumers, and education. But nevertheless, the guidance is not at all intended to be prescriptive. It clearly must be adapted to specific contexts. So next slide. So as noted, member countries endorsing the 10 elements of agroecology simultaneously ask for proof. What is the evidence that this is a beneficial path for countries, communities, and farmers to pursue? And even as there has been an increasing amount of evidence showing the positive impacts of agroecology on the environment, on biodiversity, on farmers' incomes, and on adaptation and mitigation to climate change, until recently, the evidence has remained fragmented and in isolated case studies. The need for harmonized evidence on agroecology was a systematic recommendation from all of the global and regional consultations on agroecology organized between 2014 and 2018, and was specifically requested by FAO governing bodies in 2018. So thus, through the formation of a working group and expert consultations, a tool called TAPE, Tool for Agroecology Performance Evaluation, was created. And TAPE has 2 important steps. So the first one is to help a farmer, community, or initiative assess where they stand on the transition to agroecology. Thus, again, not to say this is in, this is out, but to highlight success and to suggest areas for improvement. This is step 1, in which the 10 elements of agroecology are used to characterize production systems by assessing their levels of transition to agroecology. This diagnostic can be used to identify strengths and weaknesses of the system assessed, but also to monitor and evaluate projects or establish entry points for future activities to address the needs. And there's a lot more information and detail that's provided in the FAO publication of 2019 TAPE, which I have on the reference list. So to go to the next slide. I'm much more aware of how this has been applied outside of the US, but for this presentation, I wanted to make note of how it can be useful here as well. When I was teaching in the Masters of Sustainable Food Systems program at Prescott, students used the TAPE tool as a frame for student-generated case studies and found it quite effective. The next slide. More recently, myself move down. A more recent study interviewing participating women farmers in North America found that these farmers tended to lead agroecological farming projects that provide direct nutritional, environmental, educational, and social services to their communities, in line with the 10 elements of agroecology. And they use this to sort of distinguish between regions of the US and then farm size. So a lot of food for thought. I think the sample size was small, but it's an interesting entry point. If we move to the next slide, then step 2 of TAPE, to answer the demand for metrics to assess the performance of agroecology based on multiple criteria, not yield and productivity alone, a set of 10 core criteria of performance were identified. And these were land tenure, productivity, income, added value, exposure to pesticides, dietary diversity, women's empowerment, youth employment, biodiversity, and soil health. And credible methods of assessment for each of these was proposed. Again, this is in the FAO guidance document on TAPE for more detail. And I think it will be continually updated. But just to sort of indicate how this sort of application of the step 2 of TAPE was applied in 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, results of a study in 2022. These are the outcomes to apply it, showing that the higher the agroecological score through applying the core criteria was that there was a higher value both of production and that there was less food insecurity. It's an example of how those metrics can be applied. So TAPE has been applied now around the world by governments and other organizations, as can be seen here. And I think, again, this is probably from 2 years old, so there's been more, and obviously more as well in North America. So agroecology, I will go on now to talk, if we go to the next slide, to talk about agroecology in the UN Committee on World Food Security. So another way that it has entered the vocabulary of the United Nations, and I'll cover this just in brief, was through the UN Committee on World Food Security. This committee was established in 1974 and reformed, really well reformed, I would say, in 2009 as the foremost inclusive international and intergovernmental platform in the field of food security and nutrition, integrating representation from governments, UN agencies, civil society, indigenous people, financial and research institutions, philanthropic foundations, and the private sector. Using an inclusive approach, CFS develops and endorses policy recommendations and guidance on a wide range of food security and nutrition topics, and they're developed starting from scientific and evidence-based reports produced by the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, HLPE. In 2018, the member countries of CFS requested the high-level panel of experts to produce a report on agroecology and other innovations for sustainable agriculture and food systems that enhance food security and nutrition. And we were told by the CFS Secretariat that whenever there are 2 nouns in the title of a commissioned report, you have trouble. And indeed, our scoping document from which the report must build, it clearly reflected a contest going on between agroecological approaches and more biotechnology approaches, which were called other innovations for sustainable agriculture and food systems. We go to the next slide. Within the panel, we took pains to define an innovative approach to sustainable food systems more broadly, as well-articulated and well-practiced set of principles, practices, and methods set within an overarching philosophy and a vision for the future, so that each one of those innovations needed to come with this sort of set of their principles, practices, and methods, so that these could be evaluated then against the statements from that approach that reflect their system of beliefs or their guidance for decisions and behavior. So this analytical process was complex and is detailed in the HLPE report. I don't want to get into the weeds here, but just to mention, while serving on the report panel was pro bono, we did have some funds to commission systematic reviews of these different approaches. And my responsibility was to oversee a systematic review of food sovereignty and rights-based approaches to strengthen food security and nutrition across the globe, which we published in Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, and others were carried out on other approaches. So the bottom line from these systematic reviews that we could reflect in the report was that building a new global food system must be based on participation, localness, fairness, and justice. And the report also finds that innovation for sustainable food systems, it must require inclusive and participatory forms of innovation governance, information and knowledge co-production and sharing among communities and networks, and responsible innovation that steers towards social issues. Without this, as often has happened in the past, food security and nutrition eludes the communities that need it the most. The report was submitted and ultimately endorsed by the UN Committee on World Food Security, which was another strong step forward on the part of not just member governments, but the diverse community having a voice through the CFS, including civil society. But as we often see, for every action, there's a reaction. And we had concerns about the UN Food Systems Summit convened in New York in 2021 that took great pains to sideline both the CFS and the participation of farmer groups and social movements. So one step forward, half a step back, perhaps. I would say in conclusion that I still see the contest between competing paradigms of large-scale industrial farming versus agroecological farming being carried out on the international level and many others, including the US. And I don't really envision the contest as being resolved totally or soon in favor of one side or the other. But in the longer term, I think the evidence is quite strong in showing the multiple benefits of agroecology and its potential to be mainstreamed if the policy environment can support it. And our final slide. So I thank you from all the little things that run the world, and they will continue to run the world. So I think I have a reference list on the next 2 slides, which I think we can make the PowerPoint available if you wish. And I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Barbara. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A, which you should find at the bottom of the Zoom in the More section. And as we are waiting for questions to arrive, there were a couple of questions in the registration form. I'll just take one so that we can start. What is the implication for Californian agriculture? And how can the state be a leader in agroecology?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And obviously, I'm not a specialist in that. You know, I've really done my work outside of agroecology, but I think that there are definitely ways that, I mean, California has led in so many respects. And I think with this initiative, system-wide initiative, it's a great opportunity to think this through really carefully and think how California already has a number of really excellent programs. I would say, you know, a number of the Healthy Soils programs and so forth, but they've received some recent scrutiny that they're not holistic. They tend to take one aspect of the farming system and emphasize that. And I think it would be really interesting to see how they could be built out to address, say, the 10 elements of agroecology, how those could be connected more. I think it could be also very interesting to think out policies based on, there's another paper I have in my references by Avram Bixler and others on moving forward from 10 elements to policy and using that to apply the TAPE protocol as a way of looking for collecting data within California on farm household levels and to see if how that can be interpreted so that seeing how areas which need more work, areas which are already strong, I think that it would be an interesting sort of lens to take on California agriculture.
Thank you. So someone said in the chat that they couldn't see the Q&A button and there's no questions in the Q&A. So maybe you're not the only one. So you can also put in questions in the chat if needed. So
yeah, Christelle, I do see a couple of questions in the Q&A. One of them says, what role does technology and innovation play, if any, in agroecology?
Yeah, I think that those were points that we've tried to address. We certainly have tried to address in the way that we dealt with that question with the high-level panel of expert report, to say that, undoubtedly, there's no question that technology is important, but there's a lot of focus being given to technology without considering the social elements. So taken by itself, it really is not addressing the major issues, that it needs to be put into this more holistic viewpoint. And unfortunately, that's not done very often, and I think it would be a really important thing to do. That's in short.
Yeah, or I might also add there's social technologies that need to be considered, right? Like
Yeah.
ways to run networks and things like that. Well, there is one more question also about how does agroecology relate to regenerative agriculture? Are they synonymous?
So I don't think that they are necessarily synonymous. I mean, each one of them has its own sort of principles and elements, and regenerative has been a little bit more fluid, I think, and picked up by different groups which don't necessarily all agree with each other. So the basic initiative has been, I think, quite sound, with a really strong focus on soil health. But again, it doesn't necessarily, it's strong for what it does, but it isn't necessarily taking this overall comprehensive, holistic vision as a starting point. I haven't really dealt a lot with regenerative agriculture, so I'm probably not the best person to speak to that. I am interested.
Yeah, that's an important question here, since the CDFA just kind of came up with a guideline, or some are calling it a definition, I guess, for regenerative agriculture. So
yeah, I'm sure it runs into the problem of definitions, what's in and what's out, and the gray area in between. But I am interested in, when we think about how agroecology can be advanced in California, I'm interested in how organic agriculture really started in California, and it started as a civil society initiative, and it moved very far forward before it was adopted by government. And I think agroecology may, many of its starting points may be strong in the civil society sector, or in organic is important. We're organic farmers, and I know how stringent the certification system is. I think there are other ways that there can be peer-to-peer sharing among farmers, which I think is extremely strong. And those of us who are sort of small-scale farmers often feel a bit isolated, and the more we can share with each other, the better. So there are these participatory guarantee schemes where farmers carry out peer reviews of each other and help each other to see where they can improve. There's also a new kind of initiative right now called slow food farms. And this was sort of introduced by the man who's running slow food right now from Uganda. So it's not a US-based initiative, but there are some farms that are adopting it, and it will be a peer-to-peer nomination and peer-to-peer reviews. I see a lot of strength in something like that, with sharing our knowledge. And I do want to stress also, I think one of the most essential elements of agroecology, the scientific side of agroecology, is farmer-led research, is recognizing that farmers are researchers. They're researching all the time, and they have successes and failures, and they're a bit shy to share their failures, and they don't really have many vehicles for sharing their successes. But I think starting with farmers as the starting point for developing research questions is a very strong way to approach. I've worked with Sonia, actually. We worked on cover crops and collecting interviews from farmers in our valley and in other valleys, because farmers, we have a lot of we all apply a lot of cover crops, and ones that work and ones that don't, and we're in the same environment. So the more we can share with each other, the more chances we have for success. And that's just one way that farmers can be connected.
yeah, those are great points, Barbara. I'm wondering too, there's a couple other questions, but touching some more on what you just said, I'm wondering, from what you've seen in other countries, there's, governments and policies, there's researchers, and there's farmers and others in civil society. What have you seen has been most effective, or does it just vary by country, in terms of which sector is really pushing agroecology to the forefront, or how to get more traction for agroecology? Does it start with the government, or start with civil society, or?
I mean, I've worked for an intergovernmental organization, but I think I can say very honestly, it never starts with government. Government will go there if they really see that they need to, but they really need to have the pressure from coming up from below. So the more civil society demands, and the more, civil society tends to get fragmented, and often they're different issue areas. So the more that they can find the interlinkages among themselves and be able to come forward, the more effective that can be. And that, we've really seen that in many countries in Africa, which now have agroecology policies, in Latin America, certainly, and in European countries as well, recognizing that at the same time, many countries will have the same Brazilian approach. I mean, Christelle knows the French approach, and that's has been very divided between agroecology and conventional farming, and the government just, in a way, embraces both of them, and they will. But the more pressure that's put on, and I would say, I mean, the science is not going to necessarily lead it, but it can help to convince. So I'm really pleased that there is a lot more evidence coming out on the value of agroecology, and I think that's very important. And governments will fall along a bit later. That's been true of non-smoking campaigns and anti-slavery campaigns all through history. Governments came after people demanded it.
Okay, so somebody's asking if you can speak to the current commitment of FAO to continuing the progress towards supporting agroecology, and in the absence of support for agroecology from the current high-level leadership in FAO, what aspects for progress do you see at other levels, like in technical work or country-level work?
Yeah, okay, that's somebody who must be a bit knowledgeable. I didn't go into that, but we had this Brazilian director, and the current director is much more on the side of the agrochemical companies, and so there has been a bit of a step back. But it's not like the administration in the U.S. Nothing can be really destroyed that has been adopted by council. So the program of work is there for agroecology. It just probably is not getting as much attention as it once was getting. But there are many good things that are happening on national and regional levels. And I think that, if one has a limited amount of time to be looking at this, I think that may be some of the better areas to be focusing on. There was somebody who asked earlier about could FAO encourage governments to include agrobiodiversity in their national biodiversity strategy and action plans, which is run by the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there is a good initiative at FAO called biodiversity mainstreaming that has been really promoted by developing countries, and that should be addressing, really bringing in more agroecology into biodiversity governance. Yeah, so that was a good question, I thought. I would say,
I think,
yeah,
I was going to say that relates to the question from David Horowitz on how can we incentivize biodiversification of cash cropping in the Central Valley of California.
Good question. But so I'm also maybe continuing a little bit with talking about FAO's program of work. So I think it will be very difficult to mainstream agroecology and to scale it out as long as we have subsidy systems that really subsidize the large commodity producers, and really very little in the way of subsidy or support for agroecological producers. And that is, again, that's something that when you talk to policymakers about that, they're pretty reluctant. This is true cost accounting, I think, is where we're talking about that, this question of why the producers who are generating many, many benefits do not receive that recognition, and the ones who are creating many negative externalities do receive incentives. So changing that whole incentive structure, I think it will take a lot of work, but I think it's extremely important. I don't see how we go forward without doing that. And I've been working for a number of years on the concept of true cost accounting. And just last year, FAO decided to adopt that as the theme, and over 2 years of their sort of, I forget what it's called, but it's sort of their flagship publication for 2 years on true cost accounting. And they're having a meeting in Rome in April. So they're bringing that into the corridors again. And I hope we may see some traction. I would love to see some traction on it in California alone. And I would say right now that, we should not assume that agroecology is only the purview of small-scale farmers, that there are some large-scale farmers in California who are excellent, who are doing some very good work, some in the Midwest as well. And two of my closest colleagues, who are both from Argentina, have both produced publications on large-scale farming and agroecology, which could be interesting to people looking at how that might play out as well in the Central Valley of California. I don't have those on the reference list, but I can add them.
Would be great, yeah. There's some really good questions about the fact that you mentioned that there's been mostly just smaller case studies of the effectiveness of agroecology, and there's kind of a lack of comprehensive studies. So somebody's asking, what would it take to get those comprehensive studies done? And could FAO or other agencies lead the work in that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, that has been the intention behind TAPE, to have a harmonized system of gathering data. And I do, so far, it has remained, studies in different places. Oh, there's the one from there's a few regional syntheses, but I think the value of pulling those all together would be tremendous. My colleague, Lucas Garibaldi, he helped me with, we were funded by governments to carry out a protocol on when crops are suffering a pollination deficit. And we had funding from the Norwegian government to apply this in 11 countries, more than 11 countries around the world. And then Lucas, he loves meta-analysis. He reads them before he falls asleep at night. So he loves to do this sort of thing. And he just did an excellent meta-analysis, which was published in Science. And the value of having this data collected from many different environments and situations, making the conclusions that it adds up to that much more robust. I would love to see that done with TAPE. So let's hope that somebody does do that. I haven't heard that Lucas is going to do it, but there's a lot of real good people working in meta-analysis that might be able to take that up.
Well, I hope we can contribute to that here in California, since we want to do some things with the TAPE as well. There is a question about kind of a different take. Acknowledging that agroecology is an inherently political and social movement for landless peoples and peasants, how do we avoid co-optation of agroecology as the new buzzword like regenerative agriculture?
Good, very good question. Yeah, I mean, and we saw that with the UN Food System Summit, that was an attempt to really define where the world should go with agriculture, not including the voice of farmers and civil society. So that force will always be there. It's more that we can keep reinforcing the other perspective and keeping in mind that agroecology is holistic. You cannot just choose just a few of those elements and say this is agroecology. So if it's being co-opted, it's because you've dropped out some of those elements. And the critique needs to be strong against doing that.
All right, we have lots of interesting questions. There's one on what role does one-on-one relationship building among stakeholders in the international context play in advancing agroecology's implementation and funding? That's an important one too, funding.
That's a good question. And, in all of these symposia and whatever, probably the most important work goes on in the corridors. It's not necessarily in the meetings. And it can be difficult for people to be able to access those meetings. The agroecology meetings have been quite different. They've had a strong civil society participation, and people stand up and clap and cheer during the meeting, which you don't do in UN meetings usually. They're really quite lively. But that one-on-one I think it can be very important in terms of funding. One of our most important funders that came out of those meetings for FAO in the end, because FAO has been a bit ambivalent about applying government funding, has been the McKnight Foundation, and that took a lot of work to be able to get the UN to agree that they could accept funding from a philanthropic foundation. But that has funded, I would say, quite a large amount of the work that's gone on at FAO in agroecology. They've been great supporters. So yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate if it means you have to pitch up at a meeting and meet somebody in the hallway, and it should not be as difficult as that. Some donors have really done a very good job in supporting the participation of farmers from Africa and Latin America and Asia. And that's really led to the outcomes that we've gotten.
Well, interesting. If anybody else has one more question, perhaps. You can also unmute yourself and ask directly if you'd like, or type it. We certainly have a wide-ranging list of things people are wanting to know about here, so this is great. Oh, here's one in the chat. Does agroecology include animal rights and adoption of organic, veganic farming? And it's the next ethical step to eliminating animal inputs on inorganic farming, as proven in mainly Europe via the biocyclic vegan certification. Wow, that's new to me.
Yeah.
And there's greenwashing campaigns. This is more a comment. But I mean, agroecology does talk about animal welfare and animal rights, right?
It does, and that was one of the things that was brought into the principles that we developed through the HLPE process that wasn't necessarily explicit in the 10 elements, was animal welfare. And that isn't because we hadn't really explicitly put it in there. That is really an important part. And it's, of course, the whole form of agriculture changes when you really talk about animal welfare. So I think it is a really important cornerstone. Yeah, no, there's a lot of greenwashing campaigns. That certainly has been true. It's been a lot of pressure at FAO from the animal production people, and being able to really find ways of articulating the damages of the way animal agriculture is carried out without being negative on pastoralist systems has been challenging, I would say. Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest problems with the people who present the other viewpoint have access to a lot of research funds, and a lot of they're able to work on statistics quite a bit, and it is really hard. I think you can see that animal agriculture on a per cow basis maybe produces less greenhouse gases only because it's so intensive and there are so many cows and it's producing so many greenhouse gases. It's not really the way to be looking at it, but it's the arguments can be very complex and hard to get your head around. There's the question if the international crop research centers are embracing agroecology. So I started, and my husband, we started at the CGIAR centers in Nigeria, and I've been involved with a number of them, and they like FAO came very late to agroecology, but I do think now they're coming out of some of the symposium, and also the UN Food System Summit has been the members of the Coalition of the Willing and an agroecology, I don't remember the name for it, but it's based in the CG centers. And yeah, I think they're doing a good job. I think they should also be, watched carefully, that they keep it holistic, because the tendency for adopting only a few elements and not all is pretty strong in those centers.
Yeah, you certainly have knowledge of that, Barbara. Well, I think we're at time, or actually a little bit over time. I'd like to thank you so much, Barbara. I feel like we could just delve into this a lot more than we have, but it's great to even touch on it to this extent. For everybody, I've put the evaluation survey link into the chat. Please check that out. Also, the end of that survey leads to a small survey where you can put in your email address and name if you want to be contacted further about agroecology and efforts that we're doing here, specifically in California. So please do check that out. But with that, I want to thank you again, Barbara. Really, really appreciate this, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks for having me.